Welcome to MAP, the bi-weekly market access podcast hosted by me, Dr. Stefan Walzer. I am the innovator of Market Access 4.0 and a health economist by training and working in the fields of market access, reimbursement, pricing, and health economics since 2004. Discover Market Access 4.0 and unveil the future with our innovative solutions. Max Insights, our fast and easy AI-based reimbursement planning platform. Dobo, our new revolutionizing way of creating reimbursement dossiers across the globe with the first and only dossier writing AI bot. Cubo, our new AI-based objection handling platform. And Waffle, train with Waffle's virtual reality genius in an immersive environment and with an AI-based counterpart. We are Market Access 4.0. So check out our website, marketaccess4-0.com. And now let's dive into the current discussions, processes, and trends in market access across the globe. Welcome to another show of the Market Access podcast. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Marcel Boller. Marcel, you're a Swiss life science lawyer. You're advising pharma and medtech companies on regulation, reimbursement, compliance, and market access. And you bring a highly practical perspective on how legal frameworks shape innovation and patient access in healthcare. Marcel, great to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Perfect. So let's directly jump into it. I mean, there are a lot of, let's say, news, reforms, updates, whatever you want to call it, across the world, but especially also in Switzerland, where you are also located. I think you have also published quite a bit of different opinions and areas, I think on LinkedIn and other kind of, let's say, frames. And I think you have also argued that current Swiss pricing reforms are no longer just a so-called reimbursement issue, but probably a broader industrial policy issue. Can you just explain, especially maybe to listeners who are not that familiar with Switzerland as of now, what changed and why does that distinction matter now?
Okay, yes, glad to explain a little bit here. So to the core extent, we have seen now in early 2025 that MFN policy was implemented in the US by the authorities. And as we have seen later in this process, Switzerland is now part of the basket of reference countries, meaning that especially with regard to the generous basket, Switzerland is one of these reference countries. And that means that the pricing and reimbursement in Switzerland is sending a strong signal to the US, meaning that the US will now look at all these basket countries and look at the prices paid for reimbursed products there. And they will question whether is this price equal to the US price being paid by the payers there, or is it lower? And if it's lower, they want to have that in their policies as well. And that puts very much pressures on all these countries, not only Switzerland, but on all these countries to be at least on a remote equal level to the pricing level in the US, as we all know that the pharma companies all over the world generate lots of their revenues in the US. And then they do not want to endanger this revenue by just having a low price in Switzerland. That means everything here. So we are sending a really strong signal to the US when you're pricing a product. This price is immediately catched up by the US authorities, and they will look at this very closely.
Yeah, no, that's. I think this gives a good kind of, let's say, direction. I think for people, maybe especially let's say outside Europe, I think it's also probably important to mention that, of course, Switzerland is not part of the European Union, is not part of the EMA kind of process. Hence, there's also the kind of regulatory kind of, let's say, maybe call it hurdle before it comes to access, right? So is that, given also the size of Switzerland, we're coming as well to some of those further aspects on the industry policy, maybe as well another hurdle, maybe as well for the care of patients in Switzerland? I mean, Switzerland is small, maybe not part of Europe. Potentially, companies might rather say we're not targeting Switzerland anymore. Or what are your thoughts on this kind of complexity?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Stefan, for pointing that out. So let's put it that way. Before MFN, we were only kind of like a small market with a relatively transparent procedure with regard to market access. And what made us special is that we're not connected to the EU. That is correct. We have our own agency with regard to approval. That is Swissmedic. And to my understanding, Swissmedic makes a great job in approving products fast in Switzerland, and they also have to be fast, as we are always in second line when it comes to approval. So first is the FDA, second is EMA, and third is Swissmedic and the rest. So they have to be fast, they have to be clean if they want to provide approval and market access in Switzerland. That's the regulatory side. But now, post MFN or with MFN, there's another layer to this, the reimbursement layer. So it's not only about approval, having a product approved, but having that product also reimbursed in your country. And that's where all the negotiations about reimbursement comes into place. And that's why all these companies are looking very closely now to these negotiations and to the outcome as they reflect and have a huge impact to the US pricing then.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you touched base also here on a couple of, let's say, I think very important consideration. I think one is also speed of access or speed to the kind of new therapies. I think, yes, Swissmedic, from my perspective, and again, I'm not a regulatory expert, but from my outside perspective, I would say Swissmedic is relatively fast, I think at least on average. Whereas I would maybe tend to follow what I hear from industry. The BAG process, so the reimbursement process, is maybe rather on the slower end of the kind of spectrum, if you want to say it like this, right? And I know there are also politically and reform kind of discussion on speed of access. But I think there's, linked to that, of course, the cost containment, big discussions, not only across Europe, but especially also in Switzerland with respect to, let's say, budget impacts and how to control costs, all that kind of stuff. And on top of that, I think Switzerland is, of course, a quite big life science hub. So this is coming back to the industrial kind of policy. So how do you see that balance between, let's say, those three kind of areas?
Yeah, yes, you touched the critical point here, Stefan. So with regard to reimbursement, we have a procedure established, basically negotiations with the BAG until company and the BAG agree on a certain price for a specific product. That's basically all that is. And effectively, that means that one of the tactics, and that's why these negotiations and the timeline can be very lengthy, is that the BAG sometimes at least tends to lengthen the whole process if they don't see any possible agreement with the company with regard to access, with regard to a price to a certain product. We have seen that a lot with orphan drugs. Mm-hmm. Orphan drugs have only a small population, also with a small market in Switzerland. So you basically have maybe only 10 patients in Switzerland. But then again, they're quite expensive, these products, these therapies. And the BAG, to my understanding, is not fit to factor in, for example, one-off therapy in their reimbursement schemes and in their reimbursement process. So that means that we have a very, very long procedure back and forth between company and the BAG, where the BAG pushes back on evidence, on economic reasons, as well to basically push down the price in the end. And that's the core problem. here when we're looking at patient access we have a rather fast approval process with Swissmedic, but then it goes on and on with the BAG in these negotiations. If they're not coming to an agreement with regard to the price, these negotiations can go on for almost 2 years, or they just fade out because the company knows, the BAG knows, there won't be any agreement on in the near future on the price and the reimbursement here. So, but you also touched the bigger picture here, that Switzerland is, at least in theory, a real life science and pharma hub. We have Novartis and Roche, both Swiss companies and both among the global pharma leaders. And we want to also preserve that and being rational about our industry and about our global standing with regard to the pharma industry. But this is a real tension here, since we have on the one side the BAG, who has to ensure patient access, but also cost containment at the same time. And we have a very strong pharmaceutical company infrastructure here in Switzerland, where we have to provide them with a well-balanced framework that it stays that way. So with MFN also came some tensions with having your companies or your locations moved maybe to the US. So we have heard from massive investments from Novartis and Roche to commit in the US to build plants there. And these commitments and these investment decisions are then made in the US, but cannot be made at the same time in Europe and especially in Switzerland. And I believe we're kind of like a little bit on the losing side on both of these ends when it comes to patient access, but also when it comes to location and local investments.
Yeah. I think that shows already, let's say, the complexity, maybe call it like this. I think, let's say, around it. When I went through some of your further opinions, I think there were also comments on maybe call it provisional or very early reimbursement pathways in Switzerland. I think some were more saying like a reimbursement from day zero, a bit like what we know from Germany, for example. Do you think that those mechanisms represent a real progress for patient access, or are they still too limited to change launch strategy and practice, especially given what you said very early from a pricing perspective? So the kind of early access could maybe be a good kind of advancement. However, given MFN now and Switzerland part of the basket, that might potentially change the picture?
Yes. As we have seen, we're now in a revision process where there should also be a day zero procedure be put in place for reimbursement, but there will be a lot of tensions here with regard to MFN. As you said, if that comes into place, we will have some kind of provisional pricing or some provisional price in place. And it really depends on whether this is a relatively, globally speaking, a good price or not. I cannot imagine that this provisional price will be anywhere near the US price. So for the companies, such a provisional price will still be a big risk with regard to the MFN exposure they're having and they're facing, as this would be also, again, a clear pricing signal as being Switzerland in the basket. And that will be immediately picked up by the US authorities, by CMS or whatever payer there is, to be reflected in the US price. And again, there comes this eternal, for pharma companies, this eternal struggle with having the most of their revenue in the US and do not want to endanger this kind of revenue in the US just because they want to launch early or not early in Switzerland. And we all have seen the statistics about how much revenue is generated in the US in from big pharma compared to the rest of the world. But it is even worse to speak for biotech companies. I've heard biotech companies arguing numbers of around 80% of revenue being made in the US for their products. And we just have to be rational here. If you're a CEO or a shareholder of a biotech company, you do not want to endanger this 80% of your revenue just by launching in Switzerland very early. That won't and will not happen. And that's the problem with the day zero. I mean, in theory, that could be a great thing that could ensure very early patient access in Switzerland, close to Germany. We're looking with regard to patient access, we are looking very closely to Germany as well, since I think they have the better statistics in that regard. But I believe it will just not be implemented by the companies, having in mind that they're really exposed with regard to MFN here.
Yeah, I think it's of course as well important, and my kind of understanding, and I think when looking at statistics, it should probably also underpin that kind of opinion. But I think prices also in Germany, at least list prices, are also higher for most of the products in comparison to Switzerland, right? Which might as well make that a bit more tricky. Not to say that German prices might be comparable to the US. They have the same kind of discussion, of course, maybe just on a slightly different level as we just now have it for Switzerland, right?
Yes, even before MFN, my impression was when companies were launching in Europe, they were always launching first in Germany, being also a big market, but also to secure a quite good price, to my understanding, at least compared to other companies also in Europe, and And MFN made that even worse. So before MFN, you always had Germany first, and then maybe as a drive-by, you did go to the relatively transparent Swiss process to have your product reimbursed. But now with MFN, you have to really be careful about where and when to launch. And it's maybe if you're safe with Germany, say your expectation is to reach a good price there, that does not mean automatically that it's also safe to launch in Switzerland, and that's where all the problem comes from.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think another discussion we just also had a couple of weeks ago was, I think if you take the kind of political discussions we have seen in the UK when AstraZeneca has firstly decided not to launch maybe a product in their home country, England or UK in general. I mean, this could, of course, well go into a similar direction in Switzerland, right? You brought up already the two big pharma companies, but there are also a couple, let's say, mid-sized companies based in Switzerland. So, I mean, this could as well go into a direction which might as well make it very, very difficult for those pharma companies in their general decisions, right? I mean, of course, financially, commercially, I think there's probably not a big discussion. The shares, you just said, up to 80% of the revenues coming from the US. Also, prices are, of course, most of the times on a totally different level. But I think the other part is, of course, as well, then, how do you explain that, let's say, politically, right? Not only to the politicians themselves, but I think also to the individuals, to the patients, and also to the physicians, for example. I mean, this is, of course, as well adding another complexity on top, right?
Yes, you're exactly right here. So it's a really difficult situation right now for the companies to be in. Everyone would love that patient access is guaranteed, or patient access is possible in all the countries, in all the basket countries, also in Switzerland. Everybody would love that, but there's also obviously there's a cost containment element to this. The BAG also has to look at this angle. They want to keep healthcare costs in place, in check. And with that challenge, and with these two sides of the medal, it's really difficult for the companies to make the right decision here. So, and that's what I also hear directly from the companies. They're really careful and really try to playing it safe when it comes to launching in Switzerland and the rest of Europe, since there's so much uncertainty with regard to what does that mean for our US business when we're launching now in Switzerland. And before they would just take a misstep here and launching too early in Switzerland. Right now, it's just they're in basically most of them or a lot of them are in some kind of a waiting position. They want to wait until it's clear in the US whether what's the methodology will be or what their final price will be. And once they have, and my feeling is that once they have secured a stable price in the US, which they can rely on, they will also launch in the other basket countries. And I have seen that in specifically with regard to, I have a really interesting case study here with regard to Lilly. So their GLP-1 product, Mounjaro, was on hold in Switzerland for almost 2 years. So there was kind of like a freeze in the negotiations with the BAG. They could not agree on a price here. But they secured an MFN deal in November last year. They secured an MFN deal. We don't know the content of this deal or the language of this deal because it's confidential. But what we know is they agreed on the specific price on their GLP-1 product being Mounjaro. And what happened in Switzerland was that actually the whole negotiation became, from this point on, really got speed, got movement again. And on 1st of January 2026, the product was listed in Switzerland and it was reimbursed in Switzerland. And that's kind of a dynamic we will now see at the greater scale, I believe.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's just another, well, let's say it's the advancement of international reference pricing. And what we knew already across Europe for many years, but I think now it's just the key player is just being added on top. And this is, I think, exactly what you just described. I think a very nice kind of example. Of course, we all know, and that's the kind of big discussions across Europe, including, of course, Switzerland. I think the let's say social systems are under financial pressure, all of the kind of like. I presume we all kind of agree that, let's say, we need to somehow put kind of reforms or updates, let's say, of the system somehow in place. When you have a look on the current reform discussions in Switzerland, maybe especially in the perspective of the pharmaceutical or biotech kind of companies, what would a smart Swiss reform agenda look like from your perspective? One that, of course, improves affordability somehow, but it's also not weakening innovation incentives, given also the global environment with MFN and the like on top.
Yes. So we have, when it comes to pricing and reimbursement, we have this really special framing in Switzerland, a really special procedure. And one of my friends claimed that the BAG is kind of acting as a local matador. They're just in charge for everything when it comes to pricing and reimbursement. They're basically their own HTA body. They're basically their own economic body. And they're basically also kind of like their own judicial review body, because there is, strictly speaking, there is no, I mean, theoretically there is judicial review, but the BAG is smart and ties decisions together to one. So you don't get a listing if you're actually judicially challenge a decision. So nobody does that. So in the end, everything comes together with the BAG. Theoretically, we have a small political body which should also be consulted in this process, but that is actually of no concern when it comes to the outcome. It's finally and closely the BAG who takes the decision here who does all the decision making, who does all the negotiation with the companies, and that's actually really a flaw in the Swiss system that we have no separation in body. In a body, that we don't have any HTA body in place whatsoever, and actually we are also looking quite closely to the German system, as we believe that, the German system has also its flaws, but to my understanding, the German system has at least different bodies with different agendas, with different competences to look at the product and to look at the therapy during this whole pricing and reimbursement procedure. And we don't have that in Switzerland. And to that extent, and I also failed to mention another level of where the BAG is actually the local matador. It's actually in the policy making itself. At least when it comes to the ordinances, the Federal Council is in charge of drafting and putting in place these ordinances. But at the same time, the BAG is the one body to be in charge of drafting all these ordinances. So they get basically the contract from the Federal Council to actually come up with a clever pricing and reimbursement procedure, which they put in place policy-wise afterwards, and then also being in charge to perform, supervise, etc. So that such a system has to be super flawed, right? There has to be separation in these kind of, yes, but obviously the General Council in Switzerland has no know-how in that regard. So they just delegate the task of writing all these ordinances, writing all the policy to the BAG. But then again, why should the BAG endanger their power in this process by themselves? There has to be some checks and balances in place in Switzerland, which is not the case right now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's good kind of insight. We're coming a bit towards the end. And I always, like to end, of course, quite positive. So we can maybe switch or try to get a bit of a spin in the last kind of, question. If you had to advise, global market access leaders on Switzerland today, with all of the complexities we just discussed in the last minutes, what are maybe the 2 or 3 biggest misconception, maybe as well turn that into opportunities, of course, they still have about where the Swiss healthcare market is heading towards?
So, yes, I believe that a misconception is that the procedure in Switzerland is just stable. But I believe it's actually a dynamic system, and we have the possibility and the resources to adapt. Policymakers just have to be maybe pushed a little bit in that direction. But if there is a country who could afford a high quality healthcare system, it is Switzerland for sure. And that we should put that to our advantage. Right now, I believe policymakers are not there yet to see that as an outcome, but I believe in the near future we will reach an agreement on that actually Switzerland could be a leader when it comes to patient access in the world.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think this is a very nice kind of outlook, and I fully agree with that. I think, Marcel, thank you a lot for putting the perspectives, the Swiss local perspective into the global context. I think this is very, very helpful. I think probably for a lot of listeners, especially nowadays. Thank you. That was a good fun, good kind of insights also from my perspective. Hope to have you as well on the show as well in the future. Thank you, Marcel.
Thank you very much for having me, Stefan. It's a real pleasure.
Switzerland, no more just in the center of, let's say, clinical development and the innovation with the two big pharma companies, Roche and Novartis, but especially also now with MFN having Switzerland as part of their, maybe call it, pricing basket. I think Marcel brought that all in, I think, a quite nice frame with the kind of importances, keeping in mind also with other kind of reforms and reform debates which are currently happening in Switzerland. I think one of it, very key, is also, let's say, having early access from day zero, very similar to what we know from Germany. Whenever you launch in a way and you have submitted the dossier, the product is available to a given price. That given is currently still under debate in Switzerland. In Germany, it's basically the list price the company is asking for. Negotiations then start thereafter, and then there's a retrospective price adaptation. If that is then as well the case in Switzerland, needs to be seen. However, of course, it's very important now as well to see the early access might be an interesting incentive, but it also needs to be discussed given the MFN basket and the impact on the pricing and the pricing schemes in the US. I think very interestingly also, Marcel brought up a quite good and interesting example with MSD, where they it was not MSD, it was of course Lilly, with Lilly having had firstly an agreement on the MFN part and a deal in the US, and just thereafter they have then as well agreed in Switzerland to launch one of their products. Maybe this is well the future, that the global international reference pricing is now adding simply the US, and maybe the US is now simply be the first launch country, as a lot of times it was anyway, but now we have the complexity as well in terms of agreeing on the price, which was not so much the case in the US before. Otherwise, of course, we need to see as well how the industry generally reacts to that. I think there might be political discussions as well, as we have seen with AstraZeneca in the UK, but currently, at least that's what my and our experience was as well in Switzerland. People, stakeholders are in discussions, are in, let's say, trying to find agreements as well, where maybe also this part could then as well hopefully be solved. I think otherwise very important, and I like very much what Marcel said towards the very end. Switzerland, the country, should be and is probably one of the few countries which can also afford a kind of high cost healthcare system, and they might maybe be also on top of innovation and such a kind of innovative kind of system in the future. That was an episode of MAP, the Market Access podcast provided by Mars Market Access and Pricing Strategy, which is your healthcare consultancy in the German-speaking markets. MAP is available every second week with a new episode, so watch out. And in case you might have questions, contact me directly and or visit our website on www.marketaccess-pricingstrategy.de.